Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, China and the European Union held its 23rd Leaders' Meeting via video link on Friday. What was on the agenda in the midst of a complex international situation? China hosted talks between foreign ministers of Afghanistan's neighboring countries to discuss the country's economic and humanitarian crisis. How is Afghanistan faring, and what needs to be done for the country's reconstruction? Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. High-level talks between China and the European Union started on Friday. The trade agreement, along with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is expected to dominate the current agenda. What are their expectations for each other on the ongoing conflicts between Russia and Ukraine? And how can China and the EU continue their cooperation in multiple areas so as to provide more stability and certainty to the world? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined in this part by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics and Helga Zeb-LaRouche, founder and president of the Schiller Institute. Welcome to the show. John, I will start with you. Obviously, Ukraine crisis is a big deal for the EU because we are more or less like a direct involvement of the crisis. And for EU, they have their expectations for China, and China stressed very much about dialogue, about diplomacy, about peace, about a sooner end to the conflicts. But still, it's very important to understand how they see each other or their role in this crisis. Like, John, how does the EU side view the Chinese role in this crisis, vis-a-vis their relationship probably?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that this Ukraine crisis is extremely important to the Europeans at this point. And I would expect that the leaders of the European Union would go into the summit with the expectation that China would at least stand in a neutral position. China would also probably, hopefully, would exert some pressure on the Russians to wrap up this war or seek a peaceful solution for Ukraine. But in terms of sanctions, I think the European side understands very well that China is not in the camp of imposing sanctions. Together with a lot of countries, all the BRICS members, I would say entire South America, the entire Africa continent, the Middle East, many countries are in the same position as China, staying neutral with respect to this situation. But I think the Europeans' position is probably a little bit different from Washington's position, in that even though China doesn't impose sanctions, we still like to maintain a normal trading relationship with both Russia and Ukraine. But I think what differs is that the European side has never thought about, or at least never seriously talked about, imposing secondary sanctions, provided some conditions, like material support to Russia, as Biden has said in the summit meeting with President Xi. So I think that's a quite big difference. And I don't think that it has to be made that way, and because I don't think China ever would, get into a position of really on the Russian side, being a de facto alliance position with Russia. No, that's not China's current policy at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, I know a lot of people, I think the Chinese side have talked repeatedly about their position on this Ukrainian crisis. Help us understand in your own way, what's the Chinese position? Exactly, because you see pressure from Washington, a little bit from Brussels too, probably. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, so my assessment is that the Chinese government's position is definitely on the neutrality side. I delivered a speech a few days ago at Doha Forum, and I proposed this concept called principled neutrality. In other words, neutrality is basically a policy reminiscent, for example, of the splendid isolation policy in the 19th century held by the British side with respect to the conflicts on the European continent. But certainly this is a very realist kind of a strategy. I think today in the 21st century, we need to rise above that. Rise above the 19th century British realists with a dose of 21st century moralism, I guess. So my position is that, yes, we're in a neutrality position, but we need to talk about a principled neutrality position. What that means is that, for example, I would suggest restraint from selling arms, restraint from contributing anything to the military fight in Ukraine. That's the first principle, I would say. The second thing is that China should play a more proactive role in mediating truce, in mediating a political solution in Ukraine. And third, I would say, still stick with this maintaining normal trade positions, because this is very important. Historically, over the long run, sanctions actually kill more people than war. And in this case, we can already see the prospect of people dying, not just in Ukraine. I have this hypothesis that if the international community does not take actions, probably the largest toll in this war will be people outside of Ukraine. In other words, there are people, and we look at the prices of grain, the prices of food in the Middle East, for example, in North Africa, in African countries. And these high prices, due to the war, obviously, do have consequences, implications for a lot of developing countries. So, I think it's extremely important to maintain these normal trade relationships. And lastly, of course, we should really care about people in Ukraine, people who are suffering from this, in terms of providing more humanitarian aid to these
assistance. That's a good point, John. Helga, what do you think about this Ukraine issue somehow playing a part in the relationship between China and the European Union? Is there a way they can deal with the issue that will enhance or bring the two sides together instead of affecting their relationship?
Obviously the EU had on their website beforehand that they wanted to have the Ukraine issue practically the only issue, and they want China to mediate and influence Russia. But I think it is very clear that China did not want to take a side. However, given the fact that the EU economy is in a free-fall, as a matter of fact, the accumulation of the COVID now, the sanctions, Europe is not in a strong position at all. And I think, China has a conception which I think lends itself to a mediation role, and that is President Xi Jinping's idea of a shared future of the joint humanity. I think that is the most important conception right now, given the fact that we are in a situation strategically which is more dangerous than during the Cuba Missile Crisis. And therefore, what we really need, and I think China would be uniquely in a position to do that, is to propose a new international security architecture which would take into account the interest of every single country on the planet. Because the reason why we have the Ukraine crisis is because NATO expansion to the east for 30 years, which the West does not want to even discuss anymore. But the question is, how do we get out of it? We need a new security architecture, and I have proposed it to be in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 150 year of religious war in Europe. And the situation today, in face of the danger of nuclear war, is much more dangerous even than then. And I think, the Europeans, they totally are ignoring the fact that a new system is emerging based on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Russia-India-China combination. India refused to be drawn into the camp of the United States, but wants to stay neutral also. And I think, the only way how we will get out of this is if the Europeans, and finally also the United States, would understand that it is in their best interest to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative in addressing the real issues which concern all of humanity, which is the pandemic is not over. We have a hunger crisis. I think one Chinese economist recently said that as a result of the sanctions against Russia, 1 billion people is in danger of dying of hunger this year. So I think, if China would play a mediating role and say that all of these issues have to be addressed simultaneously, and then Ukraine could become a bridge rather than being a geopolitical tool between the EU and Russia, it could become a bridge in the cooperation of on the Eurasian continent.
That's a good point, Helga. You know, China stressed very much about the cooperation, you know, often win-win cooperation. China also takes pride in being the source of peace and stability. When it comes to like China, the EU cooperation, you know, we know like the two sides, they are great civilizations. They are two of the largest, you know, economies. They represent the two largest markets. So, you know, if you look at their cooperation against this background with emerging uncertainty, with even emerging the Cold War, Helga, you know, how important it is for the EU and China to further cooperate probably in multiple fields?
I think for the EU, it is much more existential than they admit, because, you know, there are two possibilities. Either the EU finds a way of cooperating with China, and that way, you know, the conflict can be solved, or there are some people in the West, especially in Great Britain and in the United States, who want a complete decoupling of the West and so-called authoritarian regimes, in which case I think the West would suffer because their values are much more based on monetarist values, as, let's say, China and the countries cooperating with the BRI, because they are putting much more focus on physical economy. So if they would go for a complete decoupling, the West would suffer. Hopefully the European Union understands that it is not in their own interest to go this way, even if Victoria Nuland was just there and told, you know, Europe to side with the US completely. So I think that, you know, a lot depends on the initiatives proposed by China, because China right now has the only policy which is a way out, and that is the shared community of the one future of humanity.
Right.
And I think more and more people realize that.
Right. John, you know, Helga mentioned about, you know, value-based policy. I'm personally, you know, I'm approving that kind of practice, because if you pay too much attention to value differences, that is a zero sum, because people are different, you know, cultures are different, you know, civilizations are different. If you say because you are different, so we cannot cooperate somehow, that's a disaster, a recipe for disaster for a lot of countries. And also you see some of the influences from Washington on Brussels, like, you know, Huawei. Huawei provides, you know, top technology and also quality service with competitive price. But they have to somehow leave, you know, some of the European market because of the pressure from Washington on the European capitals.
Well, I think a lot of countries, especially in the developing sector.
John, please, yeah,
your
go ahead.
assessment.
Yeah, John, please, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so my assessment, based on what you said, is that first of all, the whole idea of a value-based approach in itself entails a sense of a prejudice, a sense of superiority. You know, what do you mean by, you know, a value-based approach? I mean, basically, it's already implicitly saying that my value is better than your value. When people there talk about, you know, a European value, what does that mean? I mean, that sounds very racist to me. The second thing is that I think you know, even when it comes to issues of you know, democracy versus so-called authoritarian regime, you know, I think the British side, the American side, are very hypocritical when it comes to that. I mean, they go to, for example, those countries, oil-producing countries in the Middle East, trying to persuade them to ramp up production. They immediately talk to Iran, you know, about reaching this new deal, nuclear deal. They talk to Venezuela. None of these countries are, I would say, you know, qualified as democracies. In the Middle East, for example, the only country probably can be called a democracy is the country where I'm staying right now. I mean, it's Israel. The rest of the other countries are you know, not like that. And I don't think the British policy, the American policy, have any problem at all dealing with these countries. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, in short, this whole theory about, you know, diplomacy based on value, first of all, it's discriminatory and it's condescending. Second, it's totally hypocrisy. in my view. So I totally don't buy into that.
Yeah, Helga, to further cooperation, we know there is a very important trade agreement, basically investment, a comprehensive investment agreement between China and the EU. So are we going to see any headway during the summit or after the summit? Should we, probably re-energize that kind of cooperation?
Well, I think obviously it is an agreement which would benefit both sides, so it should be pushed, but I'm not so hopeful that given the geopolitical tension right now, that will be accomplished at this summit. However, I think the fact that the transatlantic financial system is collapsing, look at the hyperinflation. This was there long before the Ukraine crisis erupted. So the question of a new financial system, a new credit system, maybe in the tradition of the new Bretton Woods system, should be put on the agenda, because there is the danger of a repetition of the 2008 crisis, but much, much larger. The Federal Reserve does not dare to increase the interest rate much to fight the inflation because the indebtedness of the whole system. So a new credit policy should be put on the agenda, and in that context, then you can increase the EU-China trade agreement, and that will all be beneficial. But I think the problem is much more fundamental than it even can be addressed through that agreement.
Well, many thanks to you, Helga. Let's move on to another important event held in China earlier this week. The third foreign ministers meeting among the neighboring countries of Afghanistan was held in Tunxi, East China, with a joint statement coming afterwards. What's happening with Afghanistan since the Taliban regained power last year, and how can its neighbors support the reconstruction of the country? In this part, I'm also joined by Pavel Falkenhauer, a Russian defense analyst, and Harvey Zoldan, senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So Harvey, I will start with you. What's your takeaway of these meetings? Actually, two meetings. There's a foreign minister meeting of the neighboring countries, and also there's a Troika Plus, basically China, Russia, the U.S. plus another country or a number of countries to deal with also Afghan issues.
Well, Shenhua, it reminds me of the old Chinese saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so I believe that Afghanistan and its neighbors have taken this first step along a very difficult road, and they have to address this situation. And I believe that actually having the Troika Plus grouping, which is the first meeting since the situation in Ukraine began, to have Russia and the US at the same table is a very good sign. So I believe that this is a good start, but I worry because this is a situation in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a typical country. It's really a group of fighting warlords who cooperate when they have to, but fight most of the time. And I'm very worried that the international community is going to have a very hard time to get the people in Afghanistan to focus on this and to actually cooperate. The Taliban does not even have complete control of the country. This is one of the reasons that Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires, because the UK got enmeshed there, Russia, and before that the Soviet Union were enmeshed there, the US got enmeshed there. They were all thrown out, they were defeated or whatever. And I see going forward to be very difficult. So I think that the Taliban has to do more now, and they have to keep their promises, which they're not doing.
Well, on one hand, of course, there's international pressure, Pavel, basically pressure on the Taliban to make true their promises, right, to the international community. On the other hand, there's ongoing humanitarian crisis. 95% of the population go to bed hungry, and the UN is worried about that. They are calling for like a 4.44 billion fund, but it goes nowhere. And then there's a high official from the UN in charge of the refugee issue, basically said that the Afghan humanitarian crisis is being ignored because of what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, absolutely, we need to do something, right, Pavel?
Well, of course, there should be done something, and for Russia, this is a very, very important issue. Moscow has been for decades, and maybe even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Russians went into Afghanistan in '79, believed that Afghanistan could be a grave threat to Russia's interest in Central Asia. It's still seen as a possibility. There are some reports coming from time to time that the Haqqani network is preparing some kind of action that may destabilize Central Asia. Russia, despite the conflict in Ukraine, is keeping a serious military garrison close to the Afghan border. There's a full-strength Russian motor rifle armored division in Tajikistan. So, and there are other assets there, and we're keeping them there because Russia believes that there could be a threat. At the same time, Moscow is working with the Taliban, hoping that they will stabilize the situation there, and Afghanistan will not be a threat. Of course, the problem from the Russian point of view is that right now, with very scarce resources, and after the Russian rather large hard currency reserves were frozen by the West, there's nothing much Russia can do economically to help Afghanistan out. There are some programs there, but they are not very big, not up to the level that is needed, and Russia is providing, of course, also humanitarian aid. But again, Russia right now does not have the capability to get Afghanistan more prosperous and a more stable country. So Russia would need help from all places it can get it. And China most likely is seen as one of the most important, but not only, because actually Afghanistan is a special place where everyone wants stability. Mm-hmm. And that's where Russia and the United States and China are at one table, because everyone wants stability in Afghanistan. No one's against it, but actually getting there to stability seems a very big problem.
Okay, John, getting stability. Where to start? Some Western nations would prioritize, for example, rights, women, children's rights, or young girls go back to school. Taliban did say they will be allowed to go to school later this month, probably, or sometimes later. But for the Chinese side, humanitarian crisis, this is also one of the priorities. People point out the U.S. freezing of these central bank assets of Afghanistan, $7 billion, and half of them were taken away, and then half of them were given to the victims of the 9/11 attack. So people are saying that, okay, we are fighting for the rights, but at the same time, should we allow people basically to leave there hungry?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. At the fundamental level, Afghanistan is an American problem. It created the problem. It has the ownership of it. And has better. He left this a whole mess just a few months ago when American troops left. And they've also, as you said, frozen the foreign exchange reserve held by the Afghanistan government. I think at this point, probably even more pressing than stability is solving the hunger problem, the starvation problem. I mean, I'm really talking about hundreds of thousands of people facing famine at this point. So and that $7 billion you talk about can save a lot of lives. So I think unfortunately at this point, I think the Afghanistan issue is probably taking a backseat. Totally overwhelmed by the issue, the crisis in Ukraine. But in reality, a lot of people are dying actually, facing the prospect of a famine. And I think Washington really needs to take the leadership. I mean, it has to, at least from a humanitarian perspective, release that $7 billion, shipping more food to solve this problem, and not just offering only rhetoric about women and girls' rights to education. That I totally agree. I mean, this is something that the international community indeed needs to advocate. But at the end of the day, it's the food on the table that saves life, and I think that's more pressing issue at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, in addition to this humanitarian assistance, from China, some of the necessary goods, for people to basically weather over the winter time. And also China is opening its market for some of the Afghan products like the nut seed over there. But at the same time, China is reportedly planning to set up like a new industrial park in Afghanistan. Probably more investment, more trade, and the Afghan foreign minister he does say that they will participate actively in the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, infrastructure could be important in creating jobs and probably revenues. Make people's lives easier, better. But I guess we have to start somewhere, right? Either humanitarian assistance, more investment, or the fight against the terrorism, or the rights for the children, for the girls.
That's true, but it's a huge problem. Even going back a little bit, there's no country has formal diplomatic relations with the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. There are 15 functioning embassies in Kabul, but there's no formal diplomatic recognition. So it's really time for the international community to step up to the plate. And John talked a little bit about this money that the U.S. has kept Afghanistan people's money and is now proposing to give it to the victims of 9/11. I think this is atrocious. It is a theft. And I think that the money needs to go there, and not today, but actually to go there yesterday, because people are starving. And with what Biden's done, I would say that the Afghan people have been robbed several times. First of all, he's trying to give away the money, and that's going to be up to the courts. Second, in order to get the money released, this is going to require a lot of expensive lawyers, and that's going to deplete the fund. And third, inflation has already depleted the fund by 40%. So we don't have a day too soon to start acting and to save the people who are dropping like flies in Afghanistan because they don't have enough to eat or they don't have shelter.
Mm-hmm. I have to point out, Pavel, this issue of this is a complaint actually from the UN official, Afghan issue, Afghan people are somehow being ignored, being forgotten, and more attention is being paid to the Ukrainian refugees crisis. But despite the differences of skin color or the hair color or whatever your beliefs are, they should be treated equally, right?
Well, yes, of course they should be treated equally, but equally they're treated not, and that's a fact. It's hard to do anything about that. Of course, there have been differences with what happened in Afghanistan and what's happening right now in Ukraine. The Afghan-American operation was okayed fully and legally by the United Nations Security Council. America went in with the support of Russia and Iran and China and India and everyone, because everyone wanted it to stabilize Afghanistan. Then it was believed that overthrowing the Taliban in the year 2000 was a good idea. I mean, everyone went with the entire world community. So the entire world community has an obligation. America has most likely a bigger moral obligation, but talking about that won't help much because the United States got out of Afghanistan and Biden got out of Afghanistan in a rather unorganized way, not to go back. And for it not to be an issue for the United States. And the United States will not take the leading role. You can call on them to do that, but they won't do that. So, and the countries that actually neighbor Afghanistan, they have the real problem on their hands, and they have to deal with it.
So,
and I believe that
yeah,
China
that's why we are
be,
having this neighboring countries meeting, right, in China. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.